Have you ever felt like everyone else got the instruction manual for life and you got a sticky note that just said, figure it out? Yeah, then you're in the right place. You're listening to the Spacious Brain podcast, where real neurodivergent humans with real jobs and real daily chaos overshare with pride. Minus the glossy, my ADHD is my superpower nonsense. Hi, I'm Noemi, a scientist, a neurodiversity coach. Yes, someone who will absolutely derail into a story from when I was 12 because I'm ADHD and tangents are my love language. If you ever felt alone or felt like the Temu version of neurodivergent because you're not an entrepreneur, not a CEO, and you forget to eat and drink on the same day, you're in the right place. Let's keep this real. In this episode, I'm joined by Ryan. Ryan is a tech founder, an entrepreneur, dad, and someone bringing much needed visibility to dyspraxia in the wider neurodiversity conversation. Ryan was diagnosed with dyspraxia at a young age, and in this episode, he shares what that actually looked like beyond the stereotype of being clumsy. We explored the hidden cognitive load, the emotional cost of constant compensation, the reality of growing up neurodivergent in systems that were never built with that in mind, and the perspective that comes from learning to understand your own spiky profile. Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Noemi. It's great to be here.
And I will start with the question that I ask as a first one for everybody, which is, who is Ryan?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Ryan Hoare. I'm 36. I'm a father. I'm a husband, and I'm also a founder of a tech company called Trimosaic, and I'm one of Noemi's new friends, and it's great to be here.
Thank you. And what is your neurotype, just for the people that are listening to us, and so that we can get into why I wanted you to be part of this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a dyspraxic, which is a particular neurotype that I don't think gets discussed very much. There's no dyspraxic TikTok and there's no dyspraxic community like there are other neurotypes. I also suspect that I might have ADHD, and some people have nudged the fact that maybe you might be autistic, but I would identify as neurodivergent at this point.
So the question that I wanted to ask you is exactly that, right? Is, as you said, there is not much information about dyspraxia. So it's still one of the least understood neurodivergent profiles. And if someone is listening and had never heard of dyspraxia before, how would you explain what it actually affects? Beyond the stereotype about being clumsy.
Yeah, sure. I mean, dyspraxia used to be called clumsy child syndrome back in the day before they called it DCD, which means developmental coordination disorder. Yeah, I mean, before it had even more kind of pejorative names before that. But basically, it's a neurotype that affects how the brain processes and carries things out. It's all about sequencing and timing and translating kind of intention into action. Now, that applies physically with things like catching and cycling and driving a car and running and lifting weights and not dropping things, which is where the clumsiness comes from. But it also affects things like planning and memory and spatial reasoning and speech and handwriting and coordination and emotional regulation. And so in some ways, dyspraxia looks very, very close and similar to things like ADHD as well. But the real friction is kind of the cognitive load. Things just cost more and are just harder to do, not because of laziness, but just because everything requires intentionality in terms of understanding what and how you're moving and how you're doing things, and kind of how you're existing in space and time, essentially.
When were you first diagnosed?
I was really young. I think I was about 5, which is like remarkably young and quite lucky in many ways. I'm quite kind of aware of how privileged I am in that sense. Yeah, and it was in school. I must have been a very, very clumsy child, I imagine. I still remember being unable to tie my shoelaces. My handwriting is appalling. I was the only child never to get a cycling proficiency badge in school. I remember never getting my pen license. I remember being bad at catching. I remember all of these things. And so it's quite obvious, I think, when you look at my development, because it's a developmental coordination disorder compared to my peers, what that looked like. And I think it has kind of knock-on effects. Even now, I'm probably the only white man in Bristol that doesn't play paddle, for example, and friends decide they want to go and do they want to go and play, squash or badminton, and I'll just pass. And so there's definitely an element of that where I can see where that comes from.
You're right. It is incredibly early, like 5 years old, for a neurodivergent diagnosis and dyspraxia as one of them. What do you specifically remember about, being diagnosed so young, and how did that shape the way you saw yourself growing up?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a bunch of things. I think I'm very lucky. I had parents, and particularly my mum, who would drill me into doing handwriting practice and doing catching and doing all the things that I didn't enjoy doing in order to learn to at least be able to, if not be good at them, be okay at them, right? I remember, doing gymnastics as a child to try and improve my coordination as much as it did or didn't help, if that makes sense. And I remember hating it. And I remember realizing that everything just was harder in a lot of sense. And yeah, it taught me that like effort was my defining trait for me. And we'll might touch on this later, but yeah, basically I have a self image built around compensating and assuming things that are going to go wrong and working as hard as you can to make sure it doesn't go wrong, and really just having that grit, I guess, to keep going, keep trying, even if things don't necessarily work out. I was always told, like, don't use this as an excuse, don't use this as an excuse. And I think there's an argument to make both ways about how helpful and healthy that is. But I think it's, in the grand scheme of things, it's been something that probably has benefited me.
But how were you as a child? If you now look back and you look at Ryan as a child growing up, with all this great, but as you were saying, this enormous cost to just be like everybody else because you were trying to fit in like a system that wasn't exactly designed for you. How, yeah, how do you see yourself?
Well, as a child,
Yes.
I was a really unhappy child. I didn't think that was just to do with dyspraxia. I think that was also potentially to do with a whole bunch of things around where I was growing up and how I was living and what I was doing and various other things. So I moved a lot as a child. And so in that sense, I was unhappy. I think there's a whole bunch of things. I think for boys in particular, I think dyspraxia can be quite brutal. And the reason is the main way boys socialize is through things like sport. And if you're bad at sport and you're not playing football, what are you doing?
Hmm.
And it's something that when I talk to dyspraxic parents, I hear time and time again. It was true of me, and it's true of them. Oh, my kids have got loads of friends who are girls, and primarily it's because there's no expectation to do sport there. And I think there's an element that's particularly underlooked. In how we kind of treat that. And I think that's something in how we kind of treat it as a society. I think it's really relevant. Like, I'm not a sporty person. I never have been. I never will be. It was never something that I really got into. And it meant that I ended up being quite isolated because I wasn't playing football and I wasn't doing things. The advantage is as you get older, like you're bonding with other adult men isn't often around sport. There's other ways of doing it. And so as I've got older, managed to compensate for that. But I remember for years being like, I don't really have many male friends. All my friends are girls. And that was why. Because there was no expectation to play five-a-side with them or, be in the rugby team or do anything else like that.
And how did that change, growing up? You were saying that this is how you felt as a child, going into high school and then later in life. Like, how did you see your evolution with what you knew about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think I accepted my dyspraxia until I was in my late 20s. I think this is something that you hear a lot around this kind of early diagnosis, late diagnosis conversation. The reality is, I don't think it was until I was in my late 20s, early 30s that really I had accepted and how it was for me, and how it impacted my life and how it affected my life. It took me a long time to accept this framing of, oh, I'm just different. It's not a disability. It's not disabling. It's not. And actually, there was that element there that I never really accepted. There's a whole element that was around the need for support and the need for executive functioning support that I never really clocked or knew. And so, yeah, for me, it wasn't until I got much older that I've begun to and do some work and get some coaching and things that I've begun to really piece together the pieces of this is how it affects me and this is who I am.
And it's interesting, because you said this is the reality of having an early diagnosis, right? And then there is this debate about being late diagnosed
versus being early diagnosed. And it's one of the things that I reflected myself upon it, because I have been diagnosed like almost 3 years ago now and was very late. I think the signs were always there. I now think, how was that missed for all those years? And I guess the question that I have for you is, do you think your life would have been different? And if so, how? If you've got a late diagnosis rather than an early one?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say. There obviously, we mentioned earlier, there's things like ADHD that I suspect I might be, and potentially autistic that I don't think I am, but people have mentioned it, that I don't have a diagnosis for, early or late. And so I would fall in the late diagnosed camp. But I think that something that we miss a lot in this conversation is that early diagnosis in the 80s and 90s was very different from early diagnosis in the 2010s and 2020s.
Yeah.
And an early diagnosis you know, in the 90s and in the 80s often meant you just got medicalized slurs rather than by teachers, rather than support and care. And this concept of being neuroaffirming and this concept of being neurodiverse aware and this concept of being all of these things that we talk about now, rightly so, didn't exist. And so, you get an early diagnosis, but you were still left to struggle and still left to work out what it meant and what it looked like. There wasn't social media where you could find help. There weren't, influencers, as much as you'd like or don't like the term, who could give you tips. There weren't books. There was none of these things that existed. Um, and so what do you do? And so in that sense, I think that having an early diagnosis can help. It particularly helps now. But I think this idea that I think people have that if they had an early diagnosis, they would know that they weren't broken. There's nothing wrong with it. Well, that's not true. We were just told to get on with it and stop making excuses. And I think people miss that. Would it make my life different? I think in some ways, I think I would have struggled. I think there's something I talk about time and time again, that actually the majority of the support I got came from my parents, and again, particularly my mum, who did a great job of advocating for me, and having that legal language and diagnosis allowed her to do that. But at the same time, it's not like you existed in this wonderful world where everything worked out because you had a diagnosis. You still end up getting things ignored or getting things that aren't. People still use it as a way of labeling you and insulting you. And so, yeah, I think it's a really complicated situation that often is not as easy as people make it out to be.
And what do you think would make it even better nowadays for somebody that is diagnosed as a child? If you're a parent yourself, right? And you
Yeah.
said that your mom did a great job advocating for you. So I guess the question that I have is, what suggestion would you give to a parent that discovers that their child is neurodivergent today?
Well, I think if you suspect your child's neurodivergent, even if you haven't got a diagnosis, treat them like they are. What's the worst that happens with that? If you think you've got a child and you think, oh, my child might be autistic because they get overstimulated, just find a way to help reduce the level of stimulation they require. Provide whatever, provide fidget toys, provide low sensory environments, provide the structure and routine you think they might need if they were autistic, even if they don't have a diagnosis.
Hmm.
And that's a lot of what kind of being neuroaffirming is about. Right? And that's what I see in my daughter. And again, I know schools are very different and all the schools are different and different schools, different things. But my daughter's school, they're really good at that. They're really good at being and framing it in that way, even if you don't have a diagnosis. And so I think that's like the biggie. But like I said, I think the way things are now compared to the way things were 30 years ago, yeah, substantially different. And that's a good thing, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, it's a journey, right? And at least it's we can see that there is a change compared to 30 years ago. And this is all we're all trying to do. We're trying to bring up the awareness and to talk about stuff so that people start to realize what it's really important.
I mean, I think there's a change compared to, my wife used to be a head teacher, and there's a change compared to 10 years ago.
Mm.
Like, there's a change compared to 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago, in terms of what the workplace looks like and what other things look like. And, in the workplace, COVID had a big benefit to that and other things. And in schools, I think you're seeing it. But yeah, I think that's kind of the reality.
I want to circle back to something that you said, that, you now suspect that you might be ADHD and autistic as well. But it's something that 30 years ago, it wasn't even possible to think, because the co-occurring of different neurotypes is something that came later on. So it wasn't even possible back then. So how does it feel today for you to realize years later that there might be parts of you that you still don't know, in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interest. So I think I've got strong views on this, and I've had people disagree with me about what I'm about to say. Like, please don't hate me or hunt me down on LinkedIn. Like, I think people who disagree also have completely legitimate views, and particularly depending on when they're diagnosed and what their journey looks like. I totally get that. But for me, I think diagnosis is a tool, not a moral achievement.
Hmm.
What do I mean? What I mean by that, right, is it unlocks support and language and potentially relief. For others, it can reopen old wounds and look at things they don't want to do. And self-understanding helps, but isn't always enough. So does that make sense?
Yes.
And so what is it you're seeking with an additional diagnosis? So I'll take me, for example, right? Dyspraxia, fine. Diagnosed early, diagnosed young, have been in the kind of, and because this is audio only, you can't see it, I'm doing air quotes, the kind of neurodivergent club, even if I didn't realize I was a member from a very, very young age. Fine. Like, that door has been open most of my life, even if I didn't realize. For me, let's say a diagnosis of, great, you have autism spectrum disorder. Great, we can confirm that you're diagnosed with that. For me, that's helpful. But given that I identify primarily as being, my identity is primarily in being neurodivergent anyway, rather than dyspraxic, because I think I have a messy profile, actually that doesn't unlock anything for me. It doesn't unlock any additional support needs. It doesn't unlock any additional tooling. It doesn't unlock any of that. And if I had no diagnosis and suspected I was autistic, then great, maybe I would go for it. The other side, though, is actually, what is ADHD in this context? Well, an ADHD diagnosis unlocks medication, for example.
Hmm.
And great, like, if you have an ADHD diagnosis, it unlocks the opportunity to take medication, which is incredibly helpful and life-changing for people. Like, now the question is that right for me? Is that something I think I would need? Is that something I would do? And I think for me, I should fully support anyone who wants to take ADHD medication. For me, I don't think it would necessarily be right for me at this point in my life. I think I've got enough coping skills and strategies to be able to avoid the need to do that. And that's not out of any sense of like, oh, it's dangerous, because it's absolutely not. Like, just to be clear, I'm not saying that. I'm saying for me, based on where I am. I'd say my view is like, do I need an additional diagnosis? And the answer for me is no. I don't think I do. I'm comfortable being like, actually, the whole neurodiversity paradigm is built around this idea that actually every brain is different, and some brains are more typical and normal than others. Normal, again, in air quotes here for audio listeners. And that I don't need a diagnosis for that. Now, if other people think differently, like, I absolutely support them in that. That's not me saying it's wrong for everyone. It's saying, I think for me, I don't think I need it. It's not an area of my identity that I'm unhappy with, but that's also potentially because there's also potentially a benefit of being diagnosed, again, air quotes, with something early. Does that make sense, Noemi?
It does. It absolutely does. And I think it's such an interesting conversation, because, I it's something that I reflected on quite a lot, because after my diagnosis with ADHD, like, it for me was a proper journey. Because imagine growing up being always like Jill of all trades, master of none, and being told constantly that, as and being labeled as a failure because of that.
Yeah.
And you have so much potential, and that that weighs on your shoulders, like, it's heavy. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, 100%.
And
I totally get it.
diagnosis, I did a personal discovery. I always say that I kind of, like, for the first time, learned who I really was. And I learned some self-compassion and some self-love, which was never there. Like, there was mainly the people pleasing that was there, but the love towards myself was never there. I remember one of the first sessions in therapy for me was like, yeah, you're talking about all of your responsibilities, but where are you in that in your priorities, where are you? Because you haven't even listed yourself. And because of that, I became estranged with my family, because I realized, my original family, because I realized that they were more toxic to me than supporting. And for me, it was affirming to know that that was the reason why I wasn't being difficult. I wasn't being too emotional as they were labeling me. There is a reason. And if you can't embrace that reason, it's on you. It's not on me. And
Yeah, no, totally. Totally get that. I mean, yeah, I totally get that. And like I said, this is a thing for me. It's not a thing for everyone else. And I think, finally discovering this about yourself, I can 100% see why for people it's liberating if they've not got that
mm,
early diagnosis, if they've not got that early diagnosis. I mean, I know there's plenty of other people though. I know plenty of other people who do have early diagnoses and are also pursuing additional diagnosis
yeah.
now because they suspect things. So like I said, it could just be a particularly me thing rather than being a particularly early or late diagnosed difference.
It depends on the story, and it depends on your journey, right? And it depends, as you were saying, like maybe a diagnosis in ADHD could support you with medication, while a diagnosis with autism cannot, because there is no medication option for that side. So it's like, do you need it? Do you actually require it? And why? What is it giving you? And it is a personal journey.
It is, and there's a whole bunch of things that come with it as well. That's the other thing to bear in mind. And this is something I've thought about. This is something I've thought about more than I think I should have, which is there is actually an element of, well, look, you know, it's not just a medical like diagnosis. It opens up a community and it opens up people who you can share to and relate to and share with. And, as you said previously, dyspraxia isn't under talked about neurotype. It is something that isn't reflected on enough and talked about enough.
Mm.
And there is no dyspraxic TikTok and there is no dyspraxia influence. Well, there are a few, but they're compared to ADHD autistic influence, a tiny, 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 tiny
Mm.
segment of what the overall market is. And there is no, you get the idea of ADHD superpowers, and we talk about kind of autistic superpowers and dyslexia is my superpower. Nobody talks about how dyspraxia is their superpower. And so I can 100% see why, for someone who also has a dyspraxia diagnosis, why they might push for an additional diagnosis just for that sense of community. I can see that. It makes perfect sense to me. And yeah, dyspraxic superpowers is something that I'm kind of pushing on at the moment. It's something I talk about quite a lot because I think we don't talk about it a lot. I think it's something that really is helpful.
And again, I want to go back to something that you mentioned about the treatment, right? That is not something for you. And same for me. Like, it's something that when it was offered, I said no, because I've lived my whole life with my brain that sounds like having 6 different concerts at the same time and a speaker and a TED talk at the same time. And if all of a sudden that would go quiet, I think I would freak out because I'm used to that. And I think it's exactly what you said. I have enough infrastructure that I've built for myself that I think I won't need it now. But it's not the same for everybody. But for
No,
you, treatment, for the conversations that we had before, for you, treatment doesn't just mean medical treatment. It means more, right? It means identity, self acceptance, it means support. So I guess apart from your infrastructures and what you have built for yourself, what is the thing that actually helped you move from that label of I'm broken, I'm different to I like myself now?
yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a bunch of things. I think language helped. I think this is where the neurodiversity paradigm is brilliant. Having that language to be able to explain myself and explain that I've got a spiky profile and being able to explain that these are my strengths and these are my weaknesses and the things that I'm good at. That really, really helped. I think meeting other neurodivergent adults helped a lot. I think, this is where ERG groups are brilliant at work because how often otherwise are you going to, particularly when you've got a very, very small neurotype where you're not able to meet with people. And this is where social media has absolutely exploded this stuff. I think doing lots of work on identity helped a lot. Moving away from, well, why can't I do this to, well, what am I good at and what do I need to succeed? Learning to like myself and learning to be, like you said, that self-acceptance.
Mm.
And I'm being told for the first time, like, would you talk to a friend the way you're talking to yourself right now? Are you being so harsh on yourself and expecting something of yourself that you wouldn't expect from other people? And that was a revelation. Like, it was a slow accumulation of evidence that got me to the point where I kind of accepted myself rather than this kind of big, all of a sudden, this is me and who I am.
And that's powerful. That's really powerful. And this is what I like about these conversations, that it brings something that I know somebody out there will listen to and they will feel like, oh yeah, yeah, that hits home. And this is where you create something that people can actually use. It's another tool for people to start this journey in a way.
Yeah.
And you're also a parent, and your daughter is like 6 years old.
Yeah, she's sick. She's wonderful.
What's her name, if I can ask?
Uh, Harriet.
And how has becoming a parent reshaped the way you think about your own childhood? And how do you approach now differences and ability with her?
Yeah, so I think I have to start by acknowledging, I think, two separate things. I think the first thing I need to acknowledge is that actually I did have really good parents who, they were never perfect, but they tried really hard to try and help and support me and do whatever it was that needed to happen. Even if it's not necessarily kind of the perfect way forward or whatever it looked like, they were brilliant. I think the second thing is that we know way more now, even as parents, than they did. And so they did like the best job they could with the information they had. That's the first thing to acknowledge. But I think you can see as a parent the difference between how you were necessarily parented and how you want to parent. And there's this kind of concept that they talk about a lot of reparenting and doing things like that. And that's something that's really important to me. Like it cracks like thing open, far more protective of her and her neurotype and how her brain works and helping to do that rather than trying to like make her do things to act more normal, like embracing the weirdness and embracing the niche interests or whatever it is that kind of she likes to do. I think it's about how do you kind of not normalize things or minimize struggles, but kind of accept it and understand that we can do things and help really lean into strengths and really focus on that.
Mm.
Yeah, it kind of, yeah. And I think it made me softer. Like seeing, again, it's that going back to that, you wouldn't do this for yourself, but you would do it for other people. And then when you realize that you're doing this for someone else, you learn to do it for yourself. And that's the key thing. Yeah.
You said something about reparenting, and that is something that I had to do. My son is 4 years old, and like for me, it's as clear as day that he is also neurodivergent. Like there is absolutely no doubt. And I am very protective of him, and particularly because I see parts of me in the things that he does.
Yeah.
And the way that you said, my parents were really good. And I think, my parents tried their best with what they had, but they didn't know. They didn't have a clue. And for many things, I was labeled with oh, you're oversensitive. She's always crying, like, and making jokes about it. And it's something that I realize now it has stuck with me as a trauma for all these years. And now that I see my son doing something like that, I'm like, he's just dysregulated. In a way, I am healing that part of me, that younger self.
I think that it's a reflection of parenting in general, though, as well. I think that neurodivergent kids, again, when I was growing up and we were growing up, kids in general, also, to be clear, but particularly neurodivergent kids, they kind of grew up learning compliance rather than self-trust.
Yes.
And, you know, for neurodivergent kids in particular, whether they had a diagnosis or not, like to be clear, they were just misunderstood inside systems that didn't adapt for them rather than that. And so it's not a case of bad parenting because actually that was all parenting. And I had a diagnosis and I was called oversensitive and I was called a whole bunch of things, which, as a boy is even worse because now, you're not just oversensitive, you're now all these other things that you would get called in the 90s. And so, yeah, I think that's the thing. It's that sense of teaching your child to do this. And the next generation's even better. And the reality is like, look, we know that neurodivergence is heavily hereditary. So if you are neurodivergent and you have children, you are likely to have neurodivergent children. And so it's the best thing you can do is to parent them in a way that is. And it's hard. It's hard because actually, look, I can say this and bang this drum and be like, this is great. Look, it's brilliant. I have a child with relatively low support needs, right? It's easy for me to say this stuff. I totally get that. I totally get that. But that's what's interesting. That's what's the bit that's hard, and that's where it goes to. And, the wiring then of what you learn to do around ignoring your body's signals and ignoring confusion and masking distress and not asking too many questions and treating effort as a moral obligation, which I still carry to this day, then just becomes burnout and anxiety and a sense of being behind when you're grown up. And actually, look, the best gift you can give to your kids as a parent is helping them understand that their brain is unique and you don't need to medicalize it. You can just, this is what you're good at, this is what you're not good at, and these are the things you can do. And in doing that, actually, you begin to heal yourself.
And I want again to cycle back because you talked before about the Spiky profile. For those that are listening and they don't know what it is, do you want to give it like an explanation, and then maybe we can put a link in the episode so that people can find out their own Spiky profile?
Yeah, sure. I know what you're referring to there. So Spiky profile is the idea that you can break down cognitive intelligence into various categories. And there's a whole range of ways you can split that and do that. And one of the ways of doing that is by, your ability. How good are you at visual reasoning? How good are you at spatial reasoning? How good are you at reading? How good are you at writing? How good are you at verbal communication? How good are you at any number of these things? Social cues. How good are you at coordination, motor coordination, that's your ability to kind of generally move, and detail, which is your ability to handwrite, which is where dyspraxia is particularly weak. And the idea is that generally people who are neurotypical have what's called a fairly flat profile. So what you'll find is that their kind of ability to be stronger or weaker in any given area tends to vary because everybody's strong and weak at different things. But what you'll tend to find is that the kind of average tends to float around the same. Now, none of this is, to be clear, like this person is on average more or less intelligent. It's just that their distribution of intelligences tends to be fairly kind of flat within a band. So you could be an absolute super genius and you tend to be good at quite a lot of things, or you could be generally, but that's the sense. Neurodivergent people tend to have what's called a spiky profile. A spiky profile is exactly what it says. It spikes up and down and up and down. And in terms of your profile, so not your absolute intelligence, to be clear, but your profile, your strengths tend to be very, very strong and your weaknesses tend to be very, very weak. And some things will sit in the middle, but generally speaking, the gap between different things are huge. And so I've done my Spiky profile. There's a whole load of tools available out there, including some by Try Mosaic, which is the software company I run. And they exist in various levels of psychometrically validated kind of strong tools that are very expensive, all the way through to kind of what we offer as Try Mosaic, which is a basically free, like, here's a slight insight generator rather than being something that we're saying is psychometrically validated. And if you look at mine, great, like things like verbal reasoning and kind of what's called synthetic thinking, which is here's a bunch of ideas and you pull them together, I tend to be really good at. But again, no surprise, being as dyspraxia at 5, my gross and fine motor coordination skills, terrible. Awful. Still got bad handwriting, still get confused, still can't really catch, there's nothing more joyous than when someone throws keys and you catch them. And I have a very, very spiky profile. And generally speaking, what you'll find is that neurodivergent people do. Generally speaking, they do. And that when they talk about superpowers in the neurodivergent community, what they're going is, my spiky profile, these are the things that I'm really good at. And if I lean into these and find a way to build a career in these, that really helps. Now, it's really important to clarify that just because you have a spiky profile, it doesn't mean that your average intelligence in that area is necessarily more intelligent than average. Often it might be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have a spiky profile, you're inherently more or less intelligent in any one of those things. It just means that for your profile. And that's really important, I think, to clarify as well.
Yeah. No, thank you. Like it explains it brilliantly. And, you talked about Try Mosaic. And do you want to tell us a bit more about what is it and why did you decide to basically build it?
Yeah, sure. So Try Mosaic is a product that originally I built for me. And I built for my network in my ERG at work. And it was basically a way of helping people to make workplace adjustments. In the UK and basically globally, so obviously different countries got slightly different laws. Disabled people, including neurodivergent people, are entitled to reasonable adjustments in the workplace. And that's just changes you can make that often are free, that can help support people in the workplace with their disabilities. Now, we get this. This makes intuitive sense for people in, say, wheelchairs, where we know that if we don't offer ramps, it's not going to work. If there's, if they're required to work on the first floor and there are no lifts, then we are actively discriminating against these people and making an environment where they can't work. We get that. We get that for people who are visually impaired, that, they will need dogs, guide dog. And if the office has a rule that says no dogs, you probably will make a tweak to the rules to go apart from guide dogs. We see that everywhere.
Yeah.
But for people who are neurodivergent, whatever that looks like, is not something that we do. And so Tri-Mosaic exists as a way of helping people articulate their needs, articulate their reasonable adjustments in the workplace, but also gives managers guidance and support on, well, is this actually reasonable? Because not every adjustment is reasonable. That's really important to point out. And then gives HR and kind of senior HR leaders also then room and guidance for them to go, well, look, this is what we are offering. This is what people have asked for. This is what we can provide. These are our gaps. These are the various things that we're doing so we can do that broader value-added HR stuff. It's something that I wish I always had. I think, again, I'm interested in hearing your story on how it happened to you when you were diagnosed. But it's something I've seen as a manager where people go, I think I might have this. What support can you provide? And as a manager, you go, I've got no idea. Or you turn up and ask someone and say, I think I've got this. And a manager goes, well, what do you need? And the person goes, I don't know. And what we help people do is through both the combination of traits, like we talked about earlier with Spiky profiles, but also through kind of, here's a diagnosis, and it's diagnosis as identity here rather than diagnosis as medicalized. That's important.
Yeah.
Go, great. You think you've got ADHD, or you are ADHD, or you identify as it, or however you want to phrase it. What are your barriers in the workplace? Here's some adjustments that might help. And that's what we do.
And, it's interesting because I've been a leader for a very long time, and I've led also big teams. And I can see how by default, if somebody's performance is not there, the assumption goes it's that person that is being difficult. It's that person that doesn't show proactiveness. And I guess one of the things that I've always done is trying to see the person behind the performance and looking at that person and saying, what's really going on here? Asking the question, are you okay?
Yeah.
And try to understand, because there might be something that they haven't even articulated. And then you realize maybe you just need this different approach. Maybe you just need this. And before my diagnosis, it didn't even came to my mind that for that to be a reasonable adjustment. If you feel that the office is too noisy, well, just go and work somewhere else where it's quieter. There is a meeting room. Just go in there by yourself. It's okay. Put yourself on do not disturb. It's fine. And then if we need to reach out, those small things. And you're right. When I got my diagnosis, and I did have somebody ask me, "Oh, do you need any adjustment?" And I was like, "No, I don't think so." It sparks the idea, and then truly ADHD style, it goes in your head. Do I need something? But why? You've always worked without it. But you might be seeing difficult if you ask for something. So there is this whole internal conversation that not only you don't know what you need, but you also feel bad about asking. So one of the things that I would love in workplaces was to make things easier for people. Like, what if you had a library of tools and things available for them that they don't have to go through a very complicated system to get them integrated. They're already there, and they don't need to tell you that they're neurodivergent in order to access them. They're there. They're there for everyone.
Yeah, so that's what we offer. The only thing I'd push back on there is that if you look at like tribunal cases, I think since 2016 cases, so the last decade, the cases for failure to make reasonable adjustments for neurodivergent people has gone up by something like 16,000%.
Wow.
So massive. So it's a huge problem. Like, yes, there are many workplaces who are neuro-inclusive by default who will go, yes, fine, if you need this, just go and do this. This isn't a problem. But it's still worth having these things documented. It's still worth having these things captured. It's still worth having these things, because all it takes is one poor manager
Yeah.
and a lack of process, and there's a problem. And that's kind of that's the other side of what we do then, is we then offer, because of our process, because we have a structured process and data is saved, the information is there for managers, and in the worst case scenario for it to exist. But yeah, I mean, the dream world is that everyone does this, but you also then have to start factoring, well, how do you manage competing reasonable adjustments? And then, again, this is where having an undocumented system that's like, well, we just let people do what they need to do, starts to then become a problem, because actually without a documented process, that's where you then create a problem. So I'll give you a great example, right? It's a common reasonable adjustment for people who are neurodivergent to have calls with their camera off.
Yes.
Really common, really cheap, free reasonable adjustment. What if the other person's deaf and lip reads?
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
manage that? You have to have a system to manage that. And that's why then, if you just have an informal system, it then starts to fall apart.
Mm.
Particularly as you start to get bigger, in reality, it starts to then fall apart. What does that look like? You've got people who, want to use fidget toys. Fine, I'm all for that. But some people who find that incredibly distracting, because actually someone else fidgeting causes them to get distracted. How do you manage that? You're managing heat temperatures for, people who are going through menopause and other things. It starts to go, well, okay, we have to create an entirely custom workspace for this. And well, you don't, but you do need to be aware of what you're offering and how you're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, like, as a system, we have benefits, even if you're a completely neuro-inclusive office that does it. And obviously and what we find is that most user adjustments are entirely reasonable. And actually, you can log on, you can request to use. A lot of it is more just documenting, this is what I've requested and this has been approved, than it is an entire rigmarole of how do you do this. But what it means is that if it's written down, it can be followed up. Whereas if it's informal, it can get missed. And that's where these problems come from. We've had managers who keep things on post-it notes and in Word documents and email chains and things. And they go, well, you wouldn't do payroll on Microsoft Word, but for some reason you're managing the HR process on it. And that's where it comes from. And obviously the other bit then is then where people request something that isn't reasonable, how do you articulate in a clearly legally defensible way as a manager that it's not reasonable?
Yeah.
Because some adjustments aren't reasonable.
It's a great discussion, and I think the more we talk about it, the more it becomes easier. It's because before nobody has ever thought about these things, and as you said, some processes are old, or they never even looked into this and how it might affect others, as you said. So there is a lot of consideration. So thank you, because it's been enlightening for me as well. So I really love this.
Yeah, I mean, a great example then. I'll give you a really good example, and this is based on some client work we did, right? Let's take noise cancelling headphones. Noise cancelling headphones, are they a reasonable adjustment? And the answer is, well, I work in an office, and so yeah, I can stick on noise cancelling headphones, no problem. I can do that. I can put on the noise block. I can do my work. Great, everyone's happy. But noise cancelling headphones, well, some of my work is in the office and some of the work's front of house. Is it reasonable? Well, it depends, because actually it's not reasonable for me to wear noise cancelling headphones when I'm talking to customers, but it is in the office. Fine. Well, noise cancelling headphones, I work in a warehouse. Are they reasonable? No, they're not actually. They're actually a safety issue, because you need to be able to hear in the warehouse in order to kind of do what you're doing. Noise cancelling headphones, I work in heavy construction. Are they a reasonable adjustment? No, they're compulsory PPE that you have to wear in order to remain safe. So the same adjustment, depending on the context, can be reasonable or not reasonable, which is, again, why that informal, this is what it looks like, needs to have that structure behind it.
I think I'm lucky in a way, because I work in pharma and I work with DMP, which is a highly regulated system. So for us, having things on a post-it note is like a no from the day one where you have your induction. Is like, no, everything is recorded, everything has a date, everything has your signature. So in a sense, that really helped shaping the way I do things as a leader as well.
Yeah,
But
no, totally.
I get your point. I want to go and ask the questions that have become the signature of this podcast. And the first one is, how do you feel about chit chat and small talk?
I love it. This is why I suspect that I might not be autistic. I absolutely love chit chat and small talk, and I could do it all day. And it's not a problem for me. Yeah, I absolutely love it.
You're the first one that I've asked this to that say that, because like it's the same for me. Like, for how long can I go on before I actually ask you about your personal story? And I mean it. Like, I want the details of your story,
Yeah.
because otherwise for me it doesn't feel real. Yeah. But it's good to see the differences, right?
I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some people who are exhausting. I find it hard, but I think that's more of a reflection on them than it is me, potentially.
The next question is, what are the traits that you genuinely love about yourself? And I want to circle back to the Spiky profile, right? So, what are the things that you see in there that you really love about yourself? And it doesn't mean that those are the ones that you're
Strongest
really,
in, yeah.
yes.
Yeah, so pattern recognition.
Hmm.
I see patterns and connections that other people miss. I'm a big synthetic thinker,
Hmm.
and I love that about myself. I love being able to go, these are all the things, and this is what it's coming for. The other trait I really love is that sense of moral stubbornness and loyalty. I'm an extremely loyal person to a fault, but I love that about myself.
And what are the traits that you still find really hard to live with, even now?
So despite saying this earlier, executive dysfunction is something that I still find hard. Just that ability to be like, I can't get my brain in gear to start something. And that is something that I still work on and still need to work on.
And my final question is, what is something about being dyspraxic that has unexpectedly enriched your life? Something that you wouldn't trade, even if you could.
Yeah, so I said this previously. Um, I think for me, it's that sense of perspective and effort. I think that I think that sense of grit of when everything fine, but do learn to do hard things and you learn to work hard and kind of work through, and like grit is like passion and perseverance for long-term goals. And I think dyspraxic grit is the same. It's like learning to ride the bike even when you're the last one, learning to catch, finding it hard to catch, but still insisting that you try and play cricket. Your handwriting doesn't work properly. It takes you twice as long. You stay after PE to practice something that everyone else has got it. And your school report says, oh, we tried hard. And that, I think, is if you learn to capture it properly and you're in the right circumstance, is that superpower. I hate the phrase, but you you learn to do it. It's an anti-superpower. It's earned and it's learned, but it's brilliant.
Thank you, Ryan. Like, I really loved our conversation, and I'm sure that whoever listens to it will find a lot of things that will resonate and will find this as amazing as I did.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
The Spacious Brain podcast will come back soon with a new episode and new stories to share. So stay tuned and follow me now, before you forget.